All right. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the second edition of Ask the Experts. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy. I am the Senior Information Security Officer at Cyber Trust Alliance. We are joined today by Alexandra. Alexandra joins us as the cyber practice lead with JKJ, and our topic today is going to be cybersecurity insurance. We'll cover a broad topic of conversation today. This is, of course, something we could easily discuss at length.
You know?
But there you are. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Technical difficulties wouldn't be a cyber related talk without them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's okay. All right. So without further ado, I already introduced you as the cyber practice lead at JKJ, Alexandra. Would you like to tell the crowd a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Because why am I considered the expert on today's call, right? So I'm a little bit unique for the insurance world. And first and foremost, thank you all for joining an insurance related conversation. I know that's not usually how people like to spend their time, but I promise to keep this interesting and engaging. So my background before joining the dark world of insurance was actually in IT consulting. So started my career at Ernst & Young, doing IT audits, SOC 2 reports, et cetera. Went on from there to do some telecom consulting for a boutique consulting firm, and then found my way actually through the Philadelphia Eagles, which is a wild story in and of itself, into the insurance world. So naturally, when I joined the insurance world, and I'm on the broker side of things, the folks I work with said, hey, given your background, this is now 7 years ago, why don't you look into this cyber thing? And at the time, many of you know, it really wasn't a hot topic of conversation. Unless you were in a field with significant privacy requirements, healthcare, financial services, a lot of folks didn't really buy cyber insurance back then. So at the time, I started looking into it, and lo and behold, with my background and everything that's now transpired over these past 7 years, it's really become a really relevant and topical risk to organizations. So I happen to be well positioned in that space, have had a lot of success. We were actually ranked top broker internationally last year, my practice. So really proud of that. I like to think we know what we're doing, but I'll be honest, I learn something new every day. This is an ever evolving risk, an ever challenging line of insurance. I am often the bearer of bad news, so you may also recognize me in my alter ego as the Grim Reaper. So, I'm excited to have some conversations around this today, and Jeremy, take this wherever you want it to go.
Sounds great. So we're excited to have you. I really appreciate you being here. I'll tell you what, let's back this up a step. Some of the people on the call may be aware or might have an idea or think they have an idea. Others might be curious and might not even know what cyber insurance is all about or why they need it. So let's talk a little bit. Tell me a little bit about what is cybersecurity insurance and why do I need it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's even take it a step back, right? Cyber insurance is just one piece of cyber risk management, right? So you manage risk, and specifically cyber risk, in many ways. You put in procedures and controls. I love the people, process, technology triangle, right? So this is part of that. This is just one component. Insurance, by definition, is a risk transfer. You're transferring off that risk of your balance sheet to the insurance company. When you think about what the cyber insurance does, it's a little bit unique relative to other lines of insurance. First and foremost, I think of it as the Ghostbusters of the cyber incident, the who you gonna call. You actually should call your cyber insurance carrier. And the reason for that, and this is where I say cyber insurance is a little unique, it comes with a boatload of services built in to get you through an incident. You don't already have to know the folks that you need to involve, the forensics firms, the legal counsel, the PR, the call centers that you might have to set up, the notifications you'd have to go through. You actually don't need to know all of those resources and go and find them for yourself. Those things are built in to your traditional cyber insurance coverage. So you've got that risk transfer. You're able to balance off your risk and have someone else cover those costs. But it also comes with those services to really guide you through the mess and chaos that really is a cyber incident. So it's the kind of thing now where I mentioned before in the past, the only organizations that really cared about this were those with more significant compliance requirements, usually being held to some standard, traditionally healthcare financial services. But nowadays, any organization is susceptible to a cyber attack, right? There's a quote I love that was by one of the systems engineers at one of the insurance companies that said, ransomware attackers don't want your data. They know that you want your data, right? It's not actually so much the value of your own data anymore. It's actually what you're willing to pay for it, less so what they're going to do with it. So that has just leveled the playing field in terms of who needs to care about this and why cyber insurance is really important.
Wow, thank you. You bring up a really interesting point. I've worked with organizations over the years in developing disaster recovery plans, incident response plans, right? And frequently they involve something along the lines of call IT. IT is going to troubleshoot it. IT might escalate it, right? But how many of us have made sure that in that incident response plan, one of the first numbers on the list is our insurance carrier to tell us how we should be handling that incident? And I think that that's a really big takeaway to start this call off with it, for people to understand that if that should be on the very top of your incident response plan. Call this
That's
number.
That is a phenomenal point, Jeremy. And if not your carrier, your broker, right? Because hopefully you're not changing brokers every year, but there's a possibility you're going to change your insurance carrier. So if you're not keeping that policy up to date, at least have a consistent contact on there. I will tell you, I participate in tabletop exercises for our clients, and there's a reason I'm involved. And it's exactly that. It's because, hey, we need to serve as a reminder that you need to engage your insurance carrier at some point in this process, because if you start going too far down the line, there's a chance that the resources you're engaging, the time and cost that you're incurring might not be covered because you didn't involve them. So you do need to get them involved very early on. They're also going to get the folks in there that know what they're doing, and especially from a breach coach standpoint. So a breach coach is a fancy name for an attorney that specializes in privacy. So much of what you do needs to comply with privacy law and regulation. And Lord knows it's not an easy task. There's 50 states of different privacy laws. There's not a federal one. It's all 50 states have their own. So anyone is susceptible to that. And then, of course, depending on what industry you're in, you may have other regulatory compliance you need to consider. HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA, PCI, etc. So having an attorney involved to make sure you don't miss reporting deadlines, that you comply with who you need to report what to in what time frame, is really, really important, and often underappreciated as part of this process.
Wow. Great points, Alexandra. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what it is, why it's important, why we need it, and how we should use it even. What about caveats? What about what it doesn't cover or what it's not? What kind of things do you see? And you started to allude a little bit to, things that you might fall into if you don't call them first or start going off the beaten path. But let's talk a little bit more about things that we might find ourselves, or situations we might find ourselves in that maybe cyber insurance isn't going to resolve.
That's a good one. So I'll tell you what, let me go through first. I like to group what cyber insurance does cover into 4 areas, and then I'll give you some of the gotchas of things like, hey, this actually isn't covered or may not be covered depending on how your policy is structured, if that's okay. So I promise to keep things pretty layman's terms. So first and foremost, bucket number 1 is incident response. So all the things I'm talking about, right? So it's going to cover the IT forensics. That's one of the first things that's going to get involved. IT forensics does not replace your IT department, right? They're going to work in tandem, whether your IT is in-house or you're using an MSP. They are going to work with them to triage, stop the bleeding, figure out where the problem is, and help determine the scope of any potential data breach. All of that is going to be done under the attorney-client privilege enacted by your breach coach. So one of the first things an insurance adjuster is going to do is assign that breach coach, and it enacts privilege. And that's really important. It's actually one of the reasons that me as a broker will sometimes then recuse myself from certain conversations or emails, because I would then pierce the veil of privilege. So being able to move with that veil, especially when you've got significant regulatory requirements, is really important. That way you can make mistakes, figure it out, all protected behind privilege. And then PR, as I mentioned, I do a lot of speaking engagements, and I tend to use a lot of sample news clippings as like past events. if you're one of my news clippings, you need PR. That's a problem. That means you hit the news and you need help. So depending on the type of operations you may have, you may need to notify your clientele, your partners, et cetera. So what should that look like? PR can help with those things. Even internal communications, right? Oftentimes when you talked about incident response planning, Jeremy, how are you going to talk to your own people? Let's just say your email's down. What does that look like? What's our chain of command there? What are we telling them? What are we telling them to tell outside parties? What does that look like? So all of those are PR type costs that can be covered. And then of course, if you do have a privacy breach situation where you have to comply with some kind of notification laws, the notification costs would be covered, the mailing, setting up a temporary call center, the credit monitoring, all of that is part of our incident response. So that was bucket number one. Bucket number two, lawsuits, regulatory, et cetera. So if you do have any kind of regulatory investigation, any kind of government body comes in and says, all right, we want to see what's going on, maybe assessing a fine or penalty, you need legal defense, that's covered. And you may be assessed a fine or penalty. As long as it's permissible to be covered by law, by insurance, your cyber insurance policy has coverage built in for that. Cyber crime is another big one. This is the one that really dominates the news, right? So we're talking extortion, ransomware type situations, phishing, social engineering attacks, et cetera. So those types of things are built in. We're going to come back to that one because that's an evolving area of cyber insurance. And then bucket number four, and this is one that I think is underappreciated, but extremely valuable. Just like your property insurance has coverage for business interruption, your revenue loss and extra expenses you incur while your building is burned down. The same thing goes and is analogous on cyber insurance. If your virtual building, your network has burned down, held ransom, just downtime for any reason, there's coverage for your revenue loss. And depending on the type of organization you are, that may be more or less significant. So you look at the average downtime of a ransomware attack, it's 19 to 20 days. I will tell you, I've lived them with my clients, and it's truly about 2 weeks. A good solid 2 weeks of whatever system is encrypted, it's down for that long. And that's regardless if they've opted to pay the ransom or not. So what does that look like for your organization? You know, if you're in the professional services space and you've got contracts, you may have that 2-week wiggle room without it completely inhibiting your revenue stream. But if you're in some, you know, a manufacturing, that could be critical. If you're in healthcare and you have to transfer your patients to receive care elsewhere because you're not able to, that's direct dollars out of your pocket. So there is revenue coverage on a cyber insurance policy. The other piece, and not all of them are created equal here, but it's another important one to consider. If you end up as one of my news clippings, if you're in the news in any way, right, you have an adverse public relations event, your network may be down for that 2 weeks. But what if you're back up and now you continue to lose cover, you continue to lose revenue? Because now people are going, oh, well, I don't want to get my product, my service, et cetera, from them. They just suffered this big attack. I don't trust them right now. So now you lose future revenue. You're already back up and running, but you're continuing to suffer loss. There's something called reputational harm. It's continued revenue buffer coverage there for just such a scenario. So really, really important to understand those things. So now let's talk about a little bit of things to look out for, things that are changing. I said I would come back to it. Ransomware is the number one thing to keep an eye on in 2022, more so than 2021. So historically, if you were acquiring a cyber insurance policy, your extortion limit, your coverage for paying the extortion demand, was equivalent to whatever policy limit you were buying in a standard off-the-shelf policy. Well, as you can imagine, with the significant uptick in ransomware attacks, and you guys are familiar with some of the big name ones, the Colonial Pipeline, right? Some of the large insurance companies have been hit. You know, a lot of different organizations out there. So now the insurance companies, they say, well, guess what? We're in this business to make money. We're not actually in it because we love paying claims. You know, they're not as altruistic as they like to seem. They've got profit margins. So paying out these ransoms started to creep up on those profit margins. So now you're seeing them go, oh, well, do we want to cover that much of this anymore? So you're seeing a lot of limitations, whether it's sublimiting the amount of coverage they're willing to offer, adding significant deductibles, or there's another way they can manipulate it called coinsurance. So an example would be they'd say, we're going to apply 50% coinsurance, meaning whatever we pay, you pay half. That's significant, right? They want your skin in the game because they want you incentivized to actually manage this risk as well as possible. But now they're really pulling back on that coverage, and that can be a lifeline for organizations. Now, anytime I'm giving these talks, I always have one person, usually somewhere in the back of the room, if virtual or not, right? Their arms are crossed and they're like, well, I would never pay a ransom. I would not negotiate with terrorists, which, spoiler alert, no one wakes up in the morning and says, I would love to pay a ransom today if I had the chance, right? No one wants to find themselves in that position. But there's a lot of reasons why people do, and it's really unfortunate when it happens. Number one, it may be more cost effective to pay the attacker to give you the key so you can decrypt your system, right? If it's a matter of timing, it actually may be faster to do that than to fail over to backups. Maybe your backups aren't good. Maybe it would be cost prohibitive to set up the whole backup system. Sometimes that's the reason. But actually, more often than not, organizations have been doing a better job of having quality backups as an alternative. So oftentimes they are able to say, all right, Mr. Hacker, I don't need you. I can actually get backup on my own without you. So over the past couple of years now, you've seen a significant trend from them just encrypting your systems to now taking out the data. It's called data exfiltration. So they're taking a copy of it and they're dangling that over you, and they're going to say, oh, okay, you don't want to pay me? I will release everything I have on the dark web unless you do. And so oftentimes ransoms are being paid for a promise not to disclose. Kind of weird that we try to trust these hackers with something like that, but believe it or not, there is some honor amongst thieves out there. The reason being, they don't want a reputation for not honoring their word, because then fewer people will pay in the future. So generally speaking, you do see them actually honor those situations. So that's my long-winded way of saying keep an eye on ransomware coverage. It's a really, really important one to have, and it's now one that is rapidly changing in terms of your insurance coverage. Other things to look out for, depending on how your IT is set up, could dictate how that business income coverage responds that I had mentioned, business interruption or business income it's called. So that revenue coverage. What I mean by that is how much of your IT is on-prem versus hosted. Hosted is great, right? Like cloud services, there's a lot of security offerings and better failover and et cetera. But we don't control it. It's hosted by somebody else. So insurance companies are also looking at that and saying, all right, when I underwrote you based off your application, I underwrote you based off the things you told me about yourself. I don't know everything about every cloud service provider that you're working with. So they'll classify that as dependent or contingent risk. You're dependent on somebody else. And sometimes they will sublimit that differently than if it were your own. So that's something to keep an eye on. If everything you're doing is hosted, you may not actually have the full limits you thought you were getting. Other things to keep an eye out on, and this goes back to your point, Jeremy, like things that are covered or not. Depending on the nature of your operations, you may or may not want to consider having bodily injury or property damage on your cyber policy. So let's think about that, right? In healthcare, if somebody gets injured under your care, typically that's going to be covered by your med-mal professional liability type exposure, right? Well, what if there's a cyber exclusion on that policy? Like traditionally speaking, insurance companies tried to add exclusions to say, hey, we don't mean to cover this. It's supposed to be covered somewhere else. So you see some professional liability people have, or companies have actually added exclusions for cyber because they're saying, hey, we don't want to cover data breaches and things. But what if your electronic medical record system is down from a cyber attack and you can't give proper medical care, and then somebody suffers injury or death, and you have an exclusion for cyber under your professional liability? Is there a possibility it's not covered? It's possible. So for that reason, you would want to consider adding bodily injury coverage to your cyber policy. Similarly, let's play through a manufacturing organization with a property damage. You insure all your property under your property policy, right? Your equipment, all of those things. What if somebody hacks in to your manufacturing industrial control system and just like shuts off a belt or a valve or a fan, and the machine jams up and costs $200,000 worth of damage. There was no fire, no rain, no flood, nothing that's going to trigger coverage under your property policy. There is nothing triggering it. Therefore, you would be uncovered unless you were adding property damage to your cyber policy. So you have to think about the cause of loss. If it's being caused by something cyber related, we need to think about ways that our cyber policy should be designed to cover it. Does that make sense? Okay.
Well, that's a really good point. That makes a lot of sense. Um, so you've given us a lot to think about for sure, and I really appreciate all of this. This has been amazing. I wanted to kind of bring it full circle to Cyber Trust Alliance and what we try to help guide our customers through. One of the things I've seen in the landscape in recent months has been a notable uptick in customers reaching out to us for assistance filling out these security questionnaires for their cyber insurance. A lot of questions about a lot of security requirements. And so I wanted to ask you to speak to that a little bit, and what, for those who maybe haven't renewed in a while and maybe their renewal's coming up, or for those that are just now considering, what kinds of things do they need to be prepared for in engaging and taking on either their next renewal or their next cyber insurance?
Yeah, so great question. To be candid, when I joined the insurance world, one of the underwriters shared with me a cyber application, and I said, "Oh, you have no idea what you're doing. You have no idea how to underwrite risk or really know when one organization is more or less risky than another." So this is 7 years ago. The good news is they're certainly getting better. So what's happened is now, in order to get quality cyber coverage, you have to meet a list of requirements. And again, it's still analogous to property, right? If you want to get coverage for your building, you probably have to have it sprinklered. So we need the virtual equivalent of sprinklers from our cybersecurity controls. So things that you've heard of over the past couple of years, multi-factor or two-factor authentication, that's now required across the board, and it's typically required in 4 areas. Number 1, email access. 2, remote access with our remote workforce. 3 is privileged accounts, which means your admin, your IT accounts. And then 4 is access to your backups for the exact reason of the ransomware attacks, right? We want to make sure that our backups are not also encrypted in the event of a ransomware attack. They're running scans on your network, the insurance companies. So they're going to see if you have these open remote desktop protocol ports and the like. They want to know that you have fully segregated backups, again, to make sure it's not also encrypted in an attack. They want to know if you've done employee training and phishing assessments, right? Because at the end of the day, employees are the gatekeepers to our organization. People, process, technology. We can go broke buying every cybersecurity technology in the world, and spoiler alert, somebody's still going to do something dumb. So as much as we can try to train our user base and increase the level of skepticism and understanding around cyber risk, the better. They want to know if you have an incident response policy, to your point, Jeremy. They're asking about that. Do you have one? Have you ever tabletopped it? Then they will ask you about some of your more technical tools. Do you have an endpoint protection system or an endpoint detection and response, or an intrusion detection system? Are you using next-gen antivirus software? Another big one, what's your patching protocol? How quickly after a critical vulnerability is communicated by one of your providers, will you implement the patch for it? If you're waiting 30 to 60 days, that's 30 to 60 days that the bad guys can be getting in. They are asking if you're doing any kind of third-party assessments, whether vulnerability assessments, pen tests, other types of compliance. And then they want to know if you're starting to manage your supply chain risk, right? Who are you working with? What are you requiring of those individuals? What kind of information and access are you giving away?
Wow. Wonderful points. Yes, exactly. Things that we've seen for sure. For those of you who haven't, I hope this has been really helpful. We are just about out of time, so I wanted to pause there for a moment and thank Alexandra so much for joining us today, for sharing all of this information. It has been tremendous. I'm sure it has been very helpful, not only for me, but for everybody else on the call. We're happy to hang out for another minute or so. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to throw it into the chat.
I could
And
talk
we'll be
about this
happy to
all
address
day.
those.
And I and I know, Jeremy, we've talked about the fact that, we may do more conversations on this. So if there's also a topic I mentioned lightly or glossed over and you want to have a more specific conversation around that, I can do a deeper dive into kind of any of these areas and talk through that. Have I worked with companies? Our company was very prepared and really minimized their cost. Yes. I will tell you, depending on the size and operations, I review those questionnaires, those cyber applications before I go to the insurance markets. And those that are already up to speed of what I know the carriers are going to be looking for do better. I will tell you the bonus piece and the piece that you should start to think about for your organization over the next 12 to 18 months is endpoint detection and response, EDR. So that's a tool that you would have to purchase. It's a software that would go on all of your endpoints. It isolates and quarantines an attack and then provides all this logging information. So if you have cyber insurance and you go through a ransomware attack today, that's one of the first things they'll do is deploy that on your network. So since that's what they're doing to try to manage the attack when it's already happening, now they're going, well, wouldn't it be great if you had this already and we didn't have to put it in for you? So you're seeing carriers start to ask about that. And if you have it, that will reduce your rates because they already know you are in a better position to minimize the impact of an attack before they're walking in the door.
Wonderful point. Wonderful point. Thank you so much for that. Any other thoughts, questions, concerns before we wrap up?
Well, something that I would love to have as a tool to bring to my customers is a little one pager that kind of sums up some of the main talking points that you brought up today, which then I would recommend that you definitely include your contact information at the bottom, because I can use that to sort of solve two problems in the same shot, which is, hey, I promise you actually do need this, because a lot of people are, nah, I'm good. And then secondly, someone to call, right, that I'm not affiliated with, who can assist and who clearly knows what they're talking about. So thank you.
So I will tell you too, and I'm happy to help you upsell in exactly that way. For me, having come from the IT background, I've waited for this to happen where
Yep.
IT and finance are together, right? That's how you
100%.
manage these things. It's a holistic risk problem. So I love when we have those conversations together. So I'm able to relay what the insurance world requires. And don't get me wrong, they're getting better at it. They're not 100% there, right? Like they don't know everything and certainly don't always appreciate sometimes when somebody's doing something that's actually truly more effective. But I'm happy to help explain the concerns and the challenges in the insurance world because the insurance world has really gone haywire since the uptick in activity.
Yes, and I completely agree regarding your point about from 7 years ago. I remember seeing these cyber applications, and I'm like, this is crazy. They're
Yeah.
they're going to we're gonna secure a policy, and these people have no idea whether or not I actually know what I'm doing with respect to the IT environment.
As recent
So
as 3 years ago, I could get a
I
policy by just
know,
putting in your name, your address, your revenue, and ballpark number of records.
completely nuts.
Didn't
Yeah.
need to know anything about your IT whatsoever.
Right. And the thing is, though, a lot of the agents still don't. And so
Mhm.
hearing you talk about that, and you clearly do, that makes a big, big difference when it comes to getting the client across the line, because right now they have to be the driver and the agent sort of like just provides what they ask, but they don't really know why. Right. So this is
100%.
very, very different. So that's good. You're probably one of the few out there that can do that. So
Yeah, I don't get scared when you put the CIO in the room. I'm okay with that part. That's usually when the
no,
other
yeah,
brokers get nervous.
maybe you can have a shot at convincing them that this is a good idea.
Yeah. Kathy asked a good question. She said, I was thinking HIPAA customers, but this really pertains to all companies, right? And Jeremy already responded to say yes, but also because every organization is susceptible to the privacy laws of the state of which their customers or employees reside, right? So if you are in Delaware, but you have employees in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland, or you have customers in those states, if you have a breach of their information, you're complying with the state where that person is, not where you work. So yes, there's compliance requirements for everybody.
Very good point. Well, guys, we are just about out of time. We've actually gone a little bit over, but we'll save the rest for a future conversation for a future time. Lots more to cover on this topic for sure. And we would be happy to have Alexandra back another time to dive in further. Alexandra, thank you so much for your time today, for your insight and for your value. We really appreciate you taking the time to walk us through cybersecurity insurance and all the different caveats we discussed.